everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. You guys know by now that we love to tackle the topics that are buzzing around, and the one we're diving into today is something I know a lot of you are really curious about. We're talking EMF radiation.
Yeah, definitely a hot topic, and for good reason.
You've sent in a ton of research on EMF, articles and studies and all kinds of stuff, so we're going to try to break it all down, see what the science really says.
Yeah, so much information out there, and honestly, so much misinformation too.
Right.
We're going to make sure to clear that up for you guys. So yeah, let's start with the basics. What is EMF radiation? Where is it coming from? And what are the real risks?
Okay, perfect. So first things first, when we say EMF radiation, what are we actually talking about? I mean, is this like the same kind of radiation we hear about with X-rays?
That's a great question. And this is where I think a lot of the confusion comes in.
Right.
The word radiation gets thrown around a lot, but it's not all created equal. You know, when we talk about EMF or electromagnetic field radiation, we're talking about energy that travels in waves.
Okay, visualize it as a spectrum. On one end, you have low-frequency, non-ionizing radiation. That's what we encounter every day from things like power lines and cell phones. On the other end, you have high-frequency ionizing radiation like X-rays and gamma rays. And that's the stuff we know can be harmful. It's got enough energy to actually break chemical bonds in our bodies. So it all comes down to the frequency of the waves.
So it's all about frequency, huh? So like different radio stations broadcasting on different frequencies kind of thing?
Exactly. And just like with radio waves, the frequency of the EMF radiation determines how much energy it carries.
Gotcha.
So while low-frequency EMF from your cell phone isn't going to, like, break apart your DNA like an X-ray can, it can still have some biological effects that are worth understanding.
Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. So let's talk about the sources of this low-frequency EMF then. One of the articles you sent mentioned it's basically everywhere, which is kind of a scary thought. It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, think about all the devices we use in a day, you know, smartphones, laptops, Wi-Fi routers, heck, even your microwave. They're all generating electromagnetic fields. And then on top of that, there's the electrical wiring in your house, power lines, and increasingly 5G cell towers.
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy when you think about it.
Yeah.
We're constantly bathed in this, like, low-level hum of EMF radiation.
Yeah, I have to admit, it's a little unsettling to think about, you know?
Oh, I know.
Like, we're so reliant on all this technology, but we don't always stop to think about, like, the invisible energy fields they're creating around us.
Right. And that's exactly why it's so important to be having these conversations. Awareness is the first step.
Absolutely.
Now, one source of EMF that I know a lot of people are particularly curious about, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about this too, is 5G.
Oh, yeah, 5G. That's like the tech buzzword of the moment, right?
Definitely.
Some people think it's like the greatest thing ever, and other people are like, it's going to fry our brains. So what's the real story there?
Well, 5G is basically the fifth generation of cellular mobile communications. It's designed to be faster and more powerful than previous generations. It operates at higher frequencies, which allows more data to be transmitted more quickly. But those higher frequencies also mean the waves are shorter.
Okay.
They don't travel as far, and they're more easily absorbed by objects, which is why 5G networks require more cell towers placed closer together.
Oh, so that's why we're seeing them popping up all over the place.
Exactly.
Okay, so faster speeds but shorter range. That's interesting. But I guess the big question on everyone's mind is, does that difference in frequency, does that have any implications for our health?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Right.
And it's really why 5G has generated so much debate. Because it operates at higher frequencies than previous generations of wireless technology, some researchers are concerned that it could have different, potentially more significant biological effects. However, this is still an area of ongoing research, and there's no conclusive evidence to say that 5G is inherently dangerous.
So it's not a clear-cut yes or no when it comes to 5G and health risks. We need more research to really understand the long-term effects.
Exactly. And while that research is being conducted, it's important to be aware of the other sources of EMF radiation that we're encountering on a daily basis.
Right, yeah. So we've established that EMF is like all around us, coming from our devices, our homes, even the infrastructure of our cities. But the big question is, what does all of this exposure actually mean for our health?
Right.
Let's dive into that now.
Okay, so we're surrounded by EMF radiation and no escaping that. But the real question is, what are the potential health risks? And this is where things seem to get, like, a little scary.
Yeah, I get why people are concerned. There's a lot of fear-mongering out there. But it's important to approach this topic with a balanced perspective, you know? The research on the health effects of low-frequency EMF radiation is still evolving, and there are a lot of unknowns. Yeah, one of the biggest concerns I see mentioned a lot is cancer. In fact, one of the articles you sent specifically cited the International Agency for Research on Cancer, the IRRC. They classify radio frequency electromagnetic fields as possibly carcinogenic to humans.
Right.
That sounds pretty serious.
It does sound alarming, but it's important to understand what that classification actually means. So the IRRC uses a scale to rank the strength of the evidence for carcinogenicity.
Okay.
Possibly carcinogenic falls into Group 2B. To put that into perspective, things like pickled vegetables and coffee are also in Group 2B.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it's more like a we need more research category than a definitive this will cause cancer warning.
Exactly. It simply means that there's some limited evidence suggesting a possible link between exposure to RF radiation and an increased risk of certain types of cancer. But the evidence isn't strong enough to make a definitive statement.
Okay, so it's not a clear-cut case. What about all the other potential health risks I've heard about? Like, I know sleep problems are a big one. One article mentioned that EMF can disrupt melatonin production, which is essential for sleep regulation.
Right.
Does that hold any weight?
Yeah, that's a great point. And there's definitely some evidence to support that claim. Studies have shown that exposure to blue light from electronic devices, as well as EMF radiation, can suppress melatonin production.
So it's like our brains are getting these mixed signals, like we're bathed in all this artificial light and EMF radiation even late at night, and our bodies are struggling to produce the hormones that tell us it's time to sleep.
That's one theory.
Okay.
And this disruption to our natural sleep-wake cycle, it can lead to a whole cascade of issues. Difficulty falling asleep, poor sleep quality, daytime fatigue, and even potentially an increased risk of other health problems over time.
Right.
It can really throw things off.
So even if we set aside the cancer concerns for a moment, there's still reason to be mindful of how much EMF we're exposed to, especially right before bed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's not just sleep that's a concern. Some studies suggest that EMF exposure might be linked to neurological effects, things like headaches, memory problems, difficulty concentrating.
Yeah, that's definitely worrisome. I know, I've definitely experienced those kinds of symptoms after spending hours staring at a screen.
Sure.
So.
It's important to remember, though, that correlation doesn't equal causation. Just because some people experience these symptoms alongside EMF exposure doesn't mean that EMF is the direct cause. That there could be other factors at play, things like stress, eye strain, or even just the mental fatigue that comes from constant information overload.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's easy to jump to conclusions. It's important to look at the whole picture. Speaking of jumping to conclusions, what about electromagnetic hypersensitivity? That's the one where people report experiencing all sorts of symptoms when they're exposed to EMF, right?
Yeah, electromagnetic hypersensitivity, or EHS. It's a condition where people attribute a wide range of symptoms to EMF exposure. Things like headaches, fatigue, dizziness, skin problems, difficulty sleeping. It's a very controversial topic, though, and there's no scientific consensus on whether EMF is actually the cause.
So, while some people genuinely experience these symptoms, it's not clear whether EMF is actually the trigger or if there's something else going on.
Exactly. Some researchers believe that EHS might be a psychosomatic condition, meaning that the symptoms are real, but they're triggered by psychological factors rather than a direct physical cause.
So it's possible that for some people, the belief that EMF is harmful is actually contributing to their symptoms, even if there's no direct physical link.
That's one theory, yeah. But it's important to acknowledge that people with EHS are experiencing real distress, regardless of the cause. More research is definitely needed to understand this complex condition and find effective treatments.
Okay, so we've covered cancer, sleep, neurological effects, and EHS. What about reproductive health? I remember reading something about concerns related to sperm quality in men.
Yeah, that's another area where more research is needed. Some studies have found an association between exposure to radiofrequency radiation from cell phones, particularly when carried in pockets, near the groin, and decreased sperm motility and viability. However, the evidence is far from conclusive, and more studies are needed to determine if there's a direct causal link.
So it's not a clear-cut case, but it's something to be mindful of, especially for, men who are concerned about fertility.
Exactly. It's all about weighing those potential risks and benefits. Another mechanism that researchers are investigating is the potential for EMF exposure to increase oxidative stress in the body.
Okay, oxidative stress. That sounds a little intimidating. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. Think of it as a kind of cellular imbalance. Our bodies are constantly producing free radicals, which are unstable molecules that can damage cells. We also produce antioxidants, which neutralize those free radicals and protect our cells.
So it's like a constant tug of war happening at a microscopic level.
That's a great analogy. And oxidative stress occurs when that balance tips in favor of the free radicals. When we have more free radicals than antioxidants, those free radicals can start to damage our cells, leading to inflammation, premature aging, and even an increased risk of chronic diseases.
Okay, that makes sense. So how does EMF radiation fit into all of this?
Well, some studies suggest that exposure to EMF radiation, particularly from sources like cell phones and Wi-Fi routers, can increase the production of free radicals in the body. And this could potentially lead to an imbalance in that delicate system of antioxidants and free radicals, tipping the scales towards oxidative stress.
I see. So even if the evidence on cancer and some of these other risks is still inconclusive, there's this underlying mechanism of oxidative stress that could be a factor in a whole range of health problems.
That's a good summary. And is why it's important to be aware of the potential effects of EMF exposure and take steps to minimize our risks, even while we wait for more definitive answers from the scientific community.
Right. It's all about being proactive and making informed choices. Speaking of choices, I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear about what they can actually do to reduce their EMF exposure. Let's move on to that now. Okay, so we've talked about what EMF radiation is, where it comes from, and some of the potential health concerns. Now let's shift gears and talk about what we can actually do to minimize our exposure. I'm feeling a little overwhelmed by all this information. I'm sure our listeners are too. So, are there any practical steps we can take to feel a little more in control of all this?
Absolutely. And the good news is that a lot of these steps are pretty simple.
Right.
Easy to incorporate into your daily routine. It's all about making small changes that can add up to a big difference in your overall exposure.
Okay, good. That's reassuring.
Yeah.
So, where do we start? What are some of the most effective ways to, reduce our EMF exposure?
One of the simplest and most effective things you can do is to prioritize wired connections over wireless whenever possible. So, for example, instead of connecting to the internet via Wi-Fi, use an Ethernet cable to plug your computer directly into your router.
I've heard that before, but to be honest, I haven't really made the switch. I guess I like the convenience of Wi-Fi, but if it's a significant difference in terms of EMF exposure, maybe it's time to reconsider. Is it really that much better?
It can be,
Yeah.
especially if you spend a lot of time online. Wi-Fi routers emit EMF radiation constantly, even when you're not actively using them.
Oh, okay.
So by using a wired connection, you're eliminating that constant exposure from your router,
Yeah.
at least for the device that you're using.
Okay, that makes sense. I guess I've been prioritizing convenience over health in this case. It happens. What about our cell phones, though? I mean, those are probably the devices that we're closest to, most often. Any tips for reducing exposure there?
Well, yeah, cell phones are a big source of EMF exposure, especially when they're held close to the head.
Right.
So whenever possible, use speakerphone or a headset for calls.
Okay.
That way you can increase the distance between the phone and your head.
I've also noticed that some headsets and earbuds now advertise themselves as having low EMF emissions. Is that something worth looking into?
Yeah, actually, some manufacturers are designing headsets specifically with reduced EMF output. It's always a good idea to, check the specifications, look for products that have been independently tested for low EMF emissions.
Good to know. Okay, so wired connections, headsets for calls. Got it.
Nope.
What about all the other devices we use throughout the day, though, like laptops, tablets, smartwatches? I mean, they all seem to be beaming out some level of EMF.
You're right. It can feel like we're surrounded.
Yeah.
One thing to be mindful of is just how close you're holding these devices to your body.
Okay.
Even a small increase in distance can significantly reduce your exposure. For example, don't work with your laptop directly on your lap,
Right.
Use a desk or a stand to create some separation.
That's a good reminder. I'm definitely guilty of working with my laptop perched on my knees sometimes. And what about those EMF shielding products that I've seen advertised? Do those actually work? I'm talking about things like phone cases, laptop pads, even special blankets.
There are a lot of EMF shielding products out there. And to be honest, their effectiveness can vary widely.
Right.
Some are designed to block or absorb EMF radiation. Others claim to harmonize it or neutralize it. It's important to do your research. Choose products from reputable companies that provide independent testing data to support their claims.
So buyer beware. Don't just believe the hype.
Exactly. Always best to approach those kinds of products with a healthy dose of skepticism. Another simple but often overlooked strategy is to just unplug devices when you're not using them.
Okay.
This not only saves energy, it also eliminates your EMF exposure from those devices.
So like unplugging my phone charger when my phone's fully charged, or turning off my Wi-Fi router at night when I'm not using it.
Exactly. It's a small change, but it can make a difference.
Right.
And speaking of nighttime, one of the most important things you can do to minimize EMF exposure and improve your sleep is to establish a digital curfew.
Yeah, I knew you were going to say that. It's like the sleep hygiene advice everyone gives, but it's so hard to resist the allure of like scrolling through social media or checking emails before bed.
I know, it's a tough habit to break.
Yeah.
But the blue light emitted from those devices, combined with the EMF radiation, it can really interfere with your sleep.
Yeah.
Aim to power down all screens at least an hour or two before bed.
Yeah, I've tried that before. And I definitely noticed a difference in my sleep quality. I think the problem is I often use my phone as my alarm clock.
Yeah, that's a common issue. If you rely on your phone as an alarm, try putting it in airplane mode or turning off Wi-Fi and cellular data at night. You'll still get your alarm, but you'll reduce your exposure to EMF while you sleep.
Oh, that's a great tip. I'm going to try that tonight. It's amazing how these small tweaks can make such a big difference.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the best part is that a lot of these strategies, they not only reduce your EMF exposure, but they also just promote a healthier lifestyle overall.
Right.
Getting more sleep, reducing screen time, being more mindful of our technology use. These are all good things for our physical and mental well-being.
So it's not about living in fear of EMF or becoming a tech-phobic hermit.
Right.
It's about finding a balance that works for you and making informed choices that prioritize your health.
Exactly. We live in a world where technology is increasingly integrated into our lives, and it's not about rejecting technology altogether. It's about using it wisely and minimizing potential risks.
Well said. I think this has been a really insightful deep dive into the world of EMF radiation. We've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the science, the sources, the practical steps we can take to reduce our exposure. What are your final thoughts on this topic?
I think the key takeaway here is that EMF radiation is all around us. And while the research on its long-term effects is still evolving, there are steps we can take to minimize our exposure and protect our health.
Right.
It's all about being informed, making conscious choices, and finding a balance that works for you.
That's a great way to sum it up. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. I know I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners have too.
It's been my pleasure. Stay curious and keep exploring.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into EMF radiation. We hope you found it informative and empowering. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.